She thought she was just having a rough time adjusting. A few sleepless nights, some anxiety in crowds. The occasional flashback she never talked about. Nothing extreme, nothing she couldn't push through. So when the VA rated her condition at 30%, she didn't argue. She didn't even question it. She figured they were probably right. After all, she was still functioning, right? But years later, during what was supposed to be a routine therapy session, something shifted. One question, just one, stopped her cold. Her therapist looked at her and said, "Has anyone ever explained how severe your symptoms actually are?" No one had. And what came next unraveled everything she thought she understood about her own mind. For the first time, she saw her life from the outside, not as someone coping or managing, but as someone quietly drowning under trauma she'd never been encouraged to name. What her therapist uncovered wasn't just painful, it was undeniable. She never knew PTSD could be rated that high. She never knew how much the system had missed. And she never expected that one conversation would lead to a complete reevaluation, not just of her benefits, but of her entire life. Because the truth is, most people don't realize how far PTSD can go until someone finally sees them, really sees them. And for her, that moment changed everything. She didn't think much of it at first. The racing heart, the way her hands tensed every time a door slammed, the way her eyes always darted to the exits in crowded rooms. It was just part of the adjustment, she told herself. A normal response to being back home after everything she'd seen. Everyone has a hard time settling in. That's what people kept saying. So she believed them. Or tried to. She chalked it up to stress. Maybe she was just being dramatic. She still got up every day, went to work, paid her bills. So how bad could it really be? What she didn't realize was that she had started reorganizing her life around her symptoms. She avoided certain places without knowing why. Loud music made her chest tighten. She hated being touched unexpectedly. And sleep? That became a nightly battle. Either she couldn't fall asleep or she'd wake up soaked in sweat, convinced something terrible had happened. But she never called it PTSD. That word felt too heavy, too dramatic. It belonged to people with visible scars, people who couldn't function, people who looked broken. Not her. So when she sat in front of VA evaluators, she downplayed everything, said she sometimes had trouble sleeping, said she got anxious in public but could manage, left out the nightmares, left out the drinking, left out the quiet moments when she couldn't breathe but didn't want anyone to know. She didn't want to sound unstable. She just wanted to get through the appointment and move on. The problem was, so did they. And by the time she got her rating in the mail, she didn't feel surprised, just confused. 30%. Enough to acknowledge something was wrong, but not enough to explain why her life still felt like a minefield. She stared at the letter, wondering if maybe this really was normal. Maybe everyone else was just better at dealing with it. So she folded it up, filed it away, and told herself to stop being dramatic. But deep down, something didn't sit right. And she wouldn't fully understand what that was. Not yet. The years that followed felt like a slow drift. Nothing was crashing down, but nothing felt stable either. She kept going, kept showing up, kept smiling when people asked how she was. But underneath, something was off. Her world had quietly shrunk, and she didn't even notice until it was already small. Her friends started to pull away. Not out of malice, but confusion. They didn't understand why she canceled plans at the last minute, why she flinched at certain sounds, why she suddenly needed to sit facing the door at every restaurant. At first, they asked if she was okay. She said she was fine. Eventually, they stopped asking. She became good at hiding, good at pretending things were normal, even when they weren't. She'd go to work, hold it together all day, then come home and collapse. Some nights, she'd pour a drink just to take the edge off, just to help her body stop vibrating. Other nights, she'd lie awake, wide-eyed, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out why she couldn't let her guard down, even in her own home. But still, she told herself this wasn't PTSD. She wasn't one of those people. She didn't have flashbacks in the middle of the street. She wasn't violent or dangerous. She didn't scream in her sleep. At least, not often. So when her rating stayed the same year after year, she didn't fight it. She assumed this was as good as it was going to get. Whenever she had follow-up exams or check-ins with the VA, she kept her answers short. She knew how to sound stable. She knew how to smile at the right times, how to avoid saying too much. And truthfully, part of her believed it, believed that if she just stayed strong enough, busy enough, quiet enough, maybe it would eventually go away. But it didn't. And with each year that passed, the gap between how she looked on the outside and how she felt inside only grew wider. Until one day, she couldn't fake it anymore. And that's when everything started to unravel. She didn't expect much from the new therapist. It was just another referral, another name on a piece of paper. She had sat through enough sessions over the years to know how they usually went. Polite questions, surface-level coping tips, maybe a handout on breathing exercises. She'd nod, say she was doing okay, and leave with nothing really changed. But this time was different. From the beginning, the therapist didn't just ask about symptoms. She asked about patterns, triggers, gaps in memory. She didn't rush. She didn't flinch when the answers got dark. And then came the question that cracked something open. Has anyone ever asked how much of your life you've built around avoiding pain? It hit her like a slap. No one had ever put it that way. She opened her mouth to respond and realized she didn't have an answer, because she didn't know. She'd never thought about it like that. Not directly. The session that followed felt like emotional whiplash. The therapist walked her through questions that made her stomach knot, about control, hypervigilance, emotional detachment, things she had always chalked up to personality quirks or bad habits. But as she answered, something started to form, a pattern she couldn't deny. By the end of the session, the therapist looked at her with quiet seriousness and said, "You're not just anxious. You're not just tired. You're showing signs of chronic severe PTSD." She sat there frozen, because hearing it out loud, hearing someone else name what she had spent years avoiding, felt like both a relief and a collapse. Part of her wanted to argue. Part of her wanted to cry. But mostly, she just felt seen. For the first time, someone had looked beneath the surface and refused to accept the version of her that had learned to perform stability. It was the moment everything began to shift, because now she couldn't unhear it. She couldn't pretend it was nothing. The question was, what would she do with that truth? At her therapist's suggestion, she submitted a request for her full VA file. She didn't expect much, maybe a few notes, some generic assessments. What she got was a thick stack of paperwork filled with cold language that somehow described her life more accurately than she ever had. She read through it slowly at first, then faster, as a strange mix of anger and disbelief started rising in her chest. Her symptoms were all there, documented in black and white: chronic insomnia, persistent hypervigilance, emotional detachment, social withdrawal, difficulty concentrating, panic responses, avoidance behaviors. It was all there, years of it. And yet somehow the rating stayed the same, 30%. She felt a wave of heat rush to her face. The numbers didn't make sense. The scale she barely paid attention to before now felt personal, like a silent judgment on her suffering. She thought about the nights she'd sat on her bathroom floor shaking, unable to breathe, the relationships that fell apart because she couldn't connect, the years she lost pretending everything was fine, and all of that had been worth 30%? It wasn't just insulting, it was erasure. She remembered one note in particular: veteran presence as composed. That single sentence stuck in her mind like a thorn. Composed. As if masking your symptoms means they don't exist. As if surviving quietly makes you less deserving of care. That's when it clicked. The system hadn't failed to see her pain. It had failed to believe it mattered. She looked up from the stack of papers and felt a heaviness settle in her chest. This wasn't just a number, it was a reflection of how little she had advocated for herself, and how willing the system had been to let her disappear beneath the surface. But now someone had pulled that truth into the light. And suddenly, silence didn't feel like an option anymore. She wasn't alone. The more she dug, the more stories she found, veterans like her, especially women who had spent years being misunderstood, overlooked, or quietly dismissed. It wasn't that their trauma was less real, it was just less obvious. The truth is, PTSD doesn't always look the way people expect. It's not always screaming nightmares or violent outbursts. Sometimes it's numbness, detachment, that blank stare when someone mentions a memory you've been trying not to feel for years. Sometimes it's the quiet routines, checking locks twice, avoiding certain streets, always keeping your back to the wall, that no one notices because they've become second nature. And for women, it gets even murkier. Many female veterans are conditioned to downplay pain, to blend in, to survive without drawing attention. They're more likely to experience trauma that doesn't fit the traditional combat narrative: harassment, assault, subtle but relentless psychological stress. And when they report symptoms, they're often misdiagnosed with anxiety, depression, or even personality issues. Anything but what it really is. The VA rating system wasn't built for nuance. It leans on visible markers, on standardized questions, on the way you present in an office for 30 minutes. If you're calm and composed, if you know how to smile through it, you're seen as stable. And if you're seen as stable, you're rarely seen as severe. But the problem isn't just with the system, it's also inside the veteran. Because by the time someone applies for help, they've already spent years trying to convince themselves they don't need it. Admitting how bad it is feels like failure. And when the paperwork arrives with a low number printed on it, it's easy to accept that maybe that's all your pain is worth. She'd done it too. Minimized everything, answered the questions with half-truths, smiled when she wanted to scream. And the VA took her at her word. Now she saw how dangerous that silence had been, not just for her, but for everyone like her. She had never really thought about what a 70% or 100% PTSD rating actually meant. To her, those numbers always sounded like they belonged to someone else, someone worse off, someone whose life had completely fallen apart. But now, for the first time, she was starting to realize that wasn't true. Those ratings didn't just reflect severity, they reflected impact, how deeply the symptoms were woven into your daily life, and how much they disrupted your ability to function. At 70%, the system is acknowledging that PTSD isn't just a background hum. It's a barrier. It's what stops you from keeping a job, from holding a relationship together, from waking up in the morning without dread. At 100%, it means it affects everything. Your mind, your mood, your ability to care for yourself. It means the trauma is no longer something you manage. It's something you're living inside of every day. And when she looked at her own life through that lens, it hit her like a punch to the chest. She had been holding herself to impossible standards, believing that because she could still function, she wasn't that bad. But functioning was just survival. It wasn't living. She was constantly exhausted, constantly disconnected, barely holding things together. And that wasn't stability. It was trauma in disguise. Her therapist helped her understand that a higher rating wasn't about pity or handouts. It was about recognition. It was the system finally saying, "We see what this has done to you. We believe you." And that changed everything. For years, she had thought of that rating as a judgment. Now she saw it as a lifeline. It meant she could access resources she never knew existed. It meant she could stop pretending, stop minimizing, stop hiding. It meant her pain wasn't invisible anymore. It didn't erase what she'd been through, but it finally gave it a name, and that name came with validation she never realized she needed. Filing for a reevaluation wasn't easy. Part of her still hesitated, still questioned whether she was bad enough to deserve more. But her therapist kept pushing, kept reminding her that this wasn't about pride. It was about truth. So she gathered the paperwork, filled out the forms, and prepared herself for the process ahead. It was frustrating from the start. Long waits, confusing instructions, repetitive questions that barely scratched the surface. Some days she wanted to quit. She felt like she was justifying something no one could see, explaining pain she'd spent years trying to hide. But every time she thought about giving up, she remembered how much of her life she had lost, not just to trauma, but to silence. She wasn't willing to lose any more. When her evaluation finally came, it was nothing like before. This time, she told the whole story. No more watered-down answers, no more hiding behind phrases like, "I'm managing," or "It's not that bad." She talked about the sleepless nights, the panic attacks, the isolation, the numbness. She talked about how hard it was to keep pretending she was okay. And when she left the office, she didn't feel ashamed. She felt relieved. Weeks passed. Then the envelope came. She opened it with shaking hands. And there it was, 100%. She sat in silence, staring at the number. It didn't feel like a victory. It felt like finally being heard. All the years she had spent second-guessing herself, downplaying her pain, trying to hold it together. It was all written there in that rating, not as a punishment, but as validation. And more than that, it gave her room to breathe. She could stop pretending. She could stop pushing through every day as if surviving meant she was fine. For the first time, she could start to heal on her own terms. The number didn't change who she was, but it gave her permission to be honest, and that was something she hadn't felt in years. Looking back, she realized the hardest part wasn't the trauma itself. It was how long she'd gone without calling it what it was. She'd spent years trying to prove she was okay, smiling through pain, shrugging off symptoms, telling herself that needing help meant she was weak. And the whole time, she was building a life around avoidance, avoiding emotions, avoiding conversations, avoiding the truth. But PTSD doesn't disappear just because you stop talking about it. It doesn't go away when you're quiet. It just settles in deeper until it becomes the background noise you forget to notice, the anxiety you think is normal, the exhaustion you assume everyone feels, the emptiness you can't explain. She thought that by staying strong, she was doing the right thing. But strength, she learned, isn't about silence. It's about honesty. It's about being brave enough to ask the uncomfortable questions and face what comes up. And for her, it took one therapist, one conversation, and one long overdue moment of truth to finally start that process. If there's one thing she wishes more people knew, it's this. You don't have to look broken to be hurting. You don't have to collapse in public to deserve support. And you don't need to wait for things to get worse before you speak up. Because sometimes the strongest thing you can do is admit that you're not okay. Her rating changed. Her circumstances changed. But what mattered most was that she changed from someone who endured in silence to someone who finally claimed her story. And maybe that's what healing really is.